Every family has secrets. Most are harmless, some are painful, but once in a generation, a family hides a secret so large that when it finally comes to light, it destroys everything. Tonight's story begins inside an ordinary house in Markham, Ontario, a quiet neighborhood, clean streets, successful families. Nothing about this place suggested that it would soon become the center of one of Canada's most disturbing criminal investigations. On the evening of November 8th, 2010, a young woman reached for a phone. Her voice was shaking. She told the emergency operator that
Are you
armed
ma'am? Please just don't my parents. Ma'am, calm down. What? Some people broke into our house. Okay, this shows all his money. Okay, ma'am, okay, ma'am, where are you? What?
Avenue.
Avenue Road.
Yes.
Can you spell the street name for me, please?
Dad. No.
Ma'am. Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Ma'am, I need to know your address. Avenue Road. Can you please spell it?
In Helen Avenue, my dad just went outside screaming.
Ma'am, can you spell the street address for me, please?
H-E-L-E-N. Someone broke in and I heard shots like pops. I don't know what's happening. I'm
He
kind of
believed he
scared.
was dying. When officers arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Blood covered parts of the basement. Furniture had been disturbed. The front door showed no obvious signs of forced entry. Inside the house, investigators discovered Bitch Pan. She had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. Nearby, her husband, Han Pan, was still alive. Barely. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, while detectives began treating the house as a violent home invasion. Everything pointed toward a robbery gone terribly wrong, and sitting inside that house was their daughter, Jennifer Pan, 24 years old, terrified, crying, bound with shoelaces. At first glance, Jennifer looked like the only surviving victim. She willingly answered every question. She explained how several armed men entered the house, how they demanded money, how they tied her up, how they forced her parents downstairs, how she listened helplessly as gunshots echoed through the basement. Everything about her story sounded believable. In fact, for several days, detectives believed it. But experienced investigators know something that most people don't. Violent crime scenes often tell two stories. The first story is the one told by the witnesses. The second is the one left behind by the evidence, and sometimes those two stories couldn't be more different. Within days, detectives noticed small details that refused to fit Jennifer's version of events. A tiny inconsistency, then another and another. None of them seemed important by themselves, but together they formed a picture that no one had expected. Because Jennifer Pan wasn't just hiding information about that night, she had been hiding the truth about her entire life. Long before a single shot was fired, Jennifer had already created a second reality, one built on lies. Lies about school, lies about university, lies about work, lies about money, lies about the future. For years, everyone closest to her believed she was living the life of a successful young woman. Almost none of it was real, and by the time those lies began falling apart, someone had already started planning something far more dangerous than another deception. This is not simply the story of a family tragedy. It's the story of how one lie became 10, then 100, until there was no way back. This is the Jennifer Pan case.
If you had met Jennifer Pan before November of 2010, there's a good chance you would have liked her. She was polite, soft spoken, respectful, the kind of person who rarely attracted attention. To neighbors, she seemed like an ordinary young woman from a hard-working family. But to understand what happened inside the Pan household, we have to go back decades before the terrifying 911 call. Jennifer's parents, Han Pan and Bitch Hat Pan, were born in Vietnam. like millions of others. They grew up during years marked by uncertainty and conflict. Eventually, they immigrated to Canada, searching for something many families dream about: stability and opportunity. They settled in Markham, Ontario. At the time, Markham was rapidly becoming one of Canada's fastest growing communities. Quiet neighborhoods, good schools, safe streets. It was exactly the kind of place where parents believed hard work could build a better future for their children. And no one worked harder than Henpan. He found work as a tool and die maker. The job demanded long hours and incredible precision. Bitch worked just as hard, helping support the family while raising their children. Nothing came easily. Every dollar they earned represented sacrifice, extra shifts, missed holidays, years of discipline. Everything they did had one purpose: to give their children opportunities they never had. Like many first generation immigrant families, education wasn't simply important, it was everything. Failure wasn't viewed as a temporary setback, it was something to overcome through more effort, more studying, more discipline. Jennifer grew up knowing exactly what her parents expected: straight A's, university, a respected career, success. There was no doubt that her parents loved her, but love inside a Penn household often came packaged with expectations. And those expectations only grew stronger as Jennifer got older. As a child, Jennifer genuinely tried to make them proud. She studied piano for years, sometimes practicing for hours each day. Competitions became normal, lessons became routine, achievements were celebrated, but over time, music was no longer enough. Academics became the family's primary focus. Jennifer attended Mary Ward Catholic Secondary School, a unique school where students learned through independent study rather than traditional classrooms. Teachers acted more like mentors. Students were expected to take responsibility for their own progress. For motivated students, it offered tremendous freedom. For others, it demanded an incredible amount of self discipline. At first, Jennifer appeared to be doing well. She talked about assignments, tests, plans for university. Everything sounded normal. Everything looked normal, at least from the outside, because hidden behind report cards and family dinners, something very different was happening. Jennifer wasn't keeping up academically. Her grades began slipping, classes became more difficult. The future her parents had imagined was slowly slipping away. Most teenagers would eventually tell the truth. Maybe after failing a class, maybe after disappointing their parents, Jennifer made a different choice. She told a lie, a small one, just enough to avoid one uncomfortable conversation, just enough to buy herself a little more time. And that's the dangerous thing about lies. A single lie is rarely enough. One lie demands another and another. Before long, Jennifer wasn't simply hiding bad grades, she was creating an entirely different version of her life, one her parents desperately wanted to believe, one that never actually existed. At first, the lies seemed harmless: a modified report card, an excuse, a story about school, nothing that looked capable of destroying an entire family. But years later, investigators would discover something chilling. The crime they were investigating didn't begin on November 8th, 2010. It had begun years earlier. By 2010, Jennifer Pan was living on borrowed time. For years, she had successfully maintained two completely different realities. One existed inside her parents' home, the other existed everywhere else. But every lie has one weakness. Eventually, someone asks the wrong question. As the months passed,
Han and Bitch Pan became increasingly suspicious. Simple conversations about university suddenly became far more detailed. They wanted to see documents, schedules, proof. Questions Jennifer had once answered effortlessly now required increasingly complicated explanations. And with every new explanation, the risk of being exposed grew larger. According to people close to the family, the atmosphere inside the Pan household changed dramatically. Trust had begun to disappear. Rules became stricter. Jennifer's freedom became more limited. She was expected to come straight home after leaving the house. Her parents closely monitored where she went, who she spent time with, and who she spoke to. One name in particular, Daniel Wong. Jennifer had first met Daniel years earlier while they were still teenagers. Their relationship continued on and off over time, despite her parents' strong objections. Han and Bitch believed Daniel was distracting Jennifer from the future they wanted for her. Eventually, they demanded that the relationship end, but ending the relationship wasn't as simple as they imagined. Jennifer continued speaking with Daniel in secret. Phone calls, text messages, private meetings. The more control her parents tried to exercise, the more carefully Jennifer hid what she was doing. Investigators would later discover that this secret relationship continued even while Jennifer was pretending to attend university. Two completely separate lives, running side by side, neither one aware of the other. Then everything changed. One day, the exact moment has been described differently over the years, but the result was the same. The carefully constructed image Jennifer had spent years protecting began to collapse. There were no more easy explanations, no more believable excuses. The questions became impossible to avoid. What university were you attending? Why couldn't anyone verify your enrollment? Where had you actually been spending your days? Those questions represented something far more dangerous than disappointment. They threatened to expose years of deception, years of carefully maintained lies, and once the truth started coming out, Jennifer's entire future seemed uncertain. According to prosecutors, this period marked a turning point. They argued that Jennifer felt trapped. She wanted to continue her relationship with Daniel. She wanted independence. She wanted freedom from the life she felt was being controlled by her parents. Whether those feelings alone explain what happened next remains impossible to know. Only Jennifer truly knows what she was thinking during those months. But investigators believed they could see a pattern beginning to emerge. Phone records later presented in court showed increasing communication between Jennifer and Daniel. The conversations themselves weren't always available. But investigators weren't only interested in what was said, they were interested in when those conversations happened, how often they happened, and who else eventually became connected through those communications. At first, none of it looked unusual. A young woman talking to someone she cared about. That, by itself, wasn't evidence of a crime, but detectives weren't looking at one phone call or one message. They were looking at hundreds. Piece by piece, they began constructing a timeline, every text, every phone call, every meeting. Slowly, a network of connections started to appear. Some of the names on that timeline would later become central figures in the investigation. At this point, Jennifer still appeared to be an ordinary young woman struggling with family pressure. Nothing publicly connected her to violence. Nothing suggested that a tragedy was only weeks away. But behind the scenes, according to the Crown's case presented at trial, plans were beginning to take shape. Plans that prosecutors argued were designed to solve every problem Jennifer believed she faced. It is important to remember that much of what happened during this period was reconstructed through digital evidence, witness testimony, and the prosecution's theory presented in court. Some conversations were never recorded, some motivations can only be inferred from the evidence. What is known for certain is that during the weeks leading up to November 8th, 2010, communication between the people who would later become suspects increased significantly. At the time, no one noticed. Neighbors saw another quiet evening in Markham. Friends believed Jennifer was simply living her life. Her parents still hoped their daughter could get her future back on track. No one realized that the countdown had already begun. In just a matter of days, everything inside the Pan family home would change forever. When the first officers arrived at the Pan residence, their priority wasn't solving a mystery, it was saving lives. Paramedics rushed inside. Han Pan was still alive, barely conscious. He was transported to the hospital within minutes. His wife, Bitch Pan, could not be saved. The house was immediately secured. Yellow tape surrounded the property. Neighbors stepped outside trying to understand why police cars had suddenly filled their quiet street. To everyone watching, it appeared to be a violent home invasion. Inside, investigators began documenting every room, every photograph, every footprint, every object that seemed out of place, because long before detectives interview a witness, they listen to the scene. Crime scenes don't speak with words, they speak through evidence. Detectives treated Jennifer as a victim. They offered support. They asked open ended questions. They wanted her to describe the evening from beginning to end. Those first interviews were not interrogations. They were an attempt to understand what had happened inside the home. Meanwhile, crime scene investigators continued their work. They documented the position of furniture, collected fingerprints, recovered items that might later become evidence. Every measurement mattered. Every photograph captured a moment that could never be recreated. Hours later, another team began looking beyond the house itself. Who had been in contact with the family? Had anyone noticed unusual activity? Were there surveillance cameras nearby? Could neighboring homes provide useful footage? The investigation expanded quickly. At this stage, nothing suggested that Jennifer Pan was a suspect. In fact, most investigators believed they were searching for a group of unknown intruders, but experienced detectives are trained to ask a simple question after every major case. Does the evidence support the story? Not, do we believe the witness? Not, does the story sound convincing? Only one question mattered. Did the physical evidence match what Jennifer described? Over the next several days, detectives reviewed photographs from the scene again and again. They compared timelines, replayed Jennifer's statements, studied the layout of the house, and slowly, small inconsistencies began to appear. None of them proved anything on their own. One detail could be explained away. Two details might still be coincidence. But when several independent facts all point in the same direction, investigators pay attention. The case was about to change, not because someone confessed, not because a new witness came forward, but because the evidence was beginning to tell a different story, and for the first time, detectives started asking a question they never expected to ask. What if the only surviving witness wasn't telling them everything? For the first few days, the investigation followed a familiar path. Detectives searched for strangers. They examined the possibility of a targeted robbery. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed surveillance footage from nearby streets, and waited for Han Pan to recover enough to speak. At the same time, Jennifer remained the investigation's most important witness. She had been inside the house. She was the only family member physically capable of describing what had happened. Investigators met with her more than once, not because they suspected her, but because memories often become clearer after traumatic events. They wanted to understand the sequence of that evening, minute by minute, room by room. As detectives compared Jennifer's interviews, they began noticing something experienced investigators are trained to recognize. Some details remained perfectly consistent. Others became less certain. That by itself wasn't unusual. People who experience traumatic events often remember them imperfectly. Investigators knew that. They weren't looking for flawless recall. They were looking for whether the overall account could be supported by independent evidence, so they started checking everything they could verify: phone records, the timing of emergency calls, the layout of the house, the movements of everyone known to have been there that evening. Every statement was treated as a hypothesis. Could it be confirmed? Could it be disproved? Slowly, the case shifted, not because of a dramatic breakthrough, but because of patience. Han Pan's condition improved for days. His survival had been uncertain. Now, investigators had an opportunity they hadn't expected. The only other person inside the house that night could finally be interviewed. His recollection of the attack became one more piece of a much larger puzzle. As detectives compared his account with the physical evidence and Jennifer's statements, new questions emerged, questions that couldn't be ignored. Why did certain details line up while others did not? Were those differences simply the result of trauma, or did they point to something more significant? The investigation entered a new phase. From that moment forward, detectives stopped asking only what happened inside the Pan home. They began asking something much more difficult. Is the story we've been given the complete story? That change in perspective transformed the entire case. Instead of searching only for unknown suspects, investigators widened their focus. Relationships, communications, financial records, digital activity, anything that could either support or contradict the timeline they were building. Every answer led to another question. Every verified fact eliminated another possibility. Piece by piece, the original theory of the case became harder to maintain, and although no conclusions had yet been reached, the investigation was no longer moving in the direction anyone had expected on the first night. The evidence wasn't shouting, it was whispering. The detectives simply had to listen. In every major investigation, there comes a moment when detectives stop asking, "What happened?" and begin asking, "What can we actually prove?" By late November, the investigation had reached that point. Jennifer Pan was no longer being interviewed simply because she had survived the attack. Investigators needed to resolve the growing gap between her account and the evidence they had collected. The interview room was quiet, no flashing lights, no raised voices, just a table, two chairs, a camera recording every word. For hours, detectives allowed Jennifer to speak. They didn't rush her. They didn't interrupt every answer. Instead, they listened. Experienced investigators know that people often reveal the most information when they believe they are still in control of the conversation. Jennifer described the events once again: the intruders, the sequence of the evening, what she remembered hearing, what she believed had happened to her parents. As she spoke, detectives compared each statement against a timeline they had already spent days building, not from memory, not from assumptions, from evidence, phone records, witness interviews, emergency call logs, crime scene photographs. Each answer was mentally placed beside a documented fact. Sometimes the two matched, sometimes they didn't. Whenever something seemed unclear, investigators returned to it later, not with accusations, with questions. Can you help us understand this? Walk us through that part again. What happened immediately after? The interview became less about individual answers and more about consistency. Good investigators aren't searching for a perfect story. They're searching for a story that remains consistent when compared with independently verified evidence. Hours passed. The atmosphere inside the room remained calm, but outside, the investigation was moving forward. Other detectives continued reviewing digital records, phone activity, communication patterns, witness statements. Each new piece of information was added to the growing timeline. Bit by bit, the picture became clearer. not because of one dramatic revelation, but because multiple independent facts began supporting the same conclusion. One investigator later described major investigations this way: you don't solve them with one clue. You solve them when dozens of ordinary details all begin pointing in the same direction. That was exactly what was happening. The interview itself was only one part of the investigation. The real breakthrough came from comparing everything together. Every statement, every verified movement, every confirmed communication, every minute of the timeline. By the end of this phase, detectives believed they understood the case far better than they had. On the night of November 8th, the investigation had changed. It was no longer driven by assumptions, it was driven by evidence. And once investigators followed that evidence wherever it led, the focus of the case changed forever. The questions they would ask next would shape everything that followed. By the time investigators completed months of interviews, forensic analysis, and digital review, they can tell a remarkably detailed story. That was the challenge facing investigators. They weren't trying to prove one suspicious moment. They had to determine whether the evidence taken as a whole supported the account that had been given from the very beginning. To do that, they built an extensive timeline. Every confirmed phone call, every verified message, every documented movement, every interview, every forensic report, each entry was checked against the others. If one detail couldn't be verified, it wasn't ignored, it was investigated. Detectives also reviewed communications connected to people who would later become central to the prosecution's case. They weren't interested in isolated conversations. They wanted to understand patterns. Who was communicating with whom? When did those conversations take place? How did those contacts fit alongside the known timeline? Investigators testified that as more records were analyzed, those patterns became increasingly significant. The case was no longer built around a single witness. Only when multiple sources pointed in the same direction did investigators consider a conclusion reliable. That careful approach would become essential in court. By the time investigators completed their work, the original theory of a random home invasion had given way to a far more complex picture. The investigation had changed direction. Now it would be up to the courts to determine what that evidence ultimately proved. Nearly 4 years after the events of November 8th, the investigation entered its final and most public stage. The courtroom, by then, detectives had spent years reviewing evidence. Experts had completed forensic examinations. Thousands of pages of reports had been prepared. Now, everything would be tested before a jury. For prosecutors, over the course of the trial, they heard testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, civilian witnesses, and people connected to the case. Each witness contributed only a small part of the overall timeline. Some explained digital evidence, others described investigative procedures, others helped establish where people were at specific moments. Together, those individual pieces formed the framework of the Crown's case. The defense viewed the evidence differently. Its role was not to prove an alternative version of events. Its role was to challenge the prosecution's conclusions. Were investigators interpreting the evidence correctly? Could there be another explanation? Had every reasonable possibility been explored? These are the kinds of questions criminal courts are designed to examine, because in a courtroom, certainty is never assumed. It must be demonstrated through evidence. Throughout the proceedings, the jury saw records, heard interviews, and listened to testimony collected over years of investigation. Jennifer Pan insisted she had survived a violent home invasion. She said armed intruders had forced their way into the house. She said she had been tied up. She said she had watched helplessly as her parents were taken downstairs. For a time, that explanation appeared believable. But as investigators compared her statements with phone records, witness interviews, and other evidence presented in court, they argued that the attack had not been a random robbery. According to prosecutors, it had been planned. The Crown alleged that Jennifer had secretly communicated with her former boyfriend, Daniel Wong, and that a group of men had been recruited to enter the Pan family home on the night of November 8, 2010. The prosecution's theory was that the original plan was to kill both of Jennifer's parents, but the plan did not unfold the way they expected. Han Pan survived, and his survival changed everything once he was able to speak with investigators. The timeline Jennifer had described began to unravel, combined with phone records and other evidence presented during the trial. Investigators concluded that the home invasion had been staged. Jennifer was arrested. So were several other people accused of participating in the plot. The case eventually went to trial. Over months of testimony, the jury heard evidence from investigators, forensic experts, witnesses, and communications records that prosecutors argued connected the defendants to the crime. The defense challenged many of those conclusions. As in every criminal trial, it was ultimately the jury's responsibility to decide whether the evidence proved the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. In December 2014, Jennifer Pan and 3 co-accused were found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bitch Pan and attempted murder of Han Pan. She received a life sentence with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. For many people, that appeared to be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Years later, Ontario's Court of Appeal reviewed the case. The court concluded that the jury instructions concerning first-degree murder required a new trial on that charge. However, Jennifer's conviction for the attempted murder of her father remained in place. Then, in 2026, rather than proceeding through another lengthy murder trial, Jennifer pleaded guilty to manslaughter in relation to her mother's death. That plea resolved the murder charge while leaving the conviction related to the attack on her father unaffected. More than 15 years have passed since the night that changed the Pan family forever. One parent never came home. Another survived with memories no family should ever have to carry. And a young woman who spent years creating a false version of her life ultimately faced the consequences of decisions that, according to the courts, ended in tragedy. The Jennifer Pan case isn't remembered simply because it shocked Canada. It's remembered because almost every person involved believed they understood the story, until the evidence revealed a very different one. Sometimes, the biggest mystery isn't who committed the crime, it's how long the truth can remain hidden. Thank you for watching. This is case room number 2, room number